So I want you to take a second, and I really want you to picture what modern office work means. What's a day like in modern office work? When you eat, where you eat, what do you spend your day doing? Sitting still, pretty much, right? I think all these new comedies about like office work that have come out in the last 5 years create a grand version of it, but it's very realistic to expect that you're going to be sitting for 8 hours a day, answering emails and phone calls, going home and doing the same thing. That's kind of how office work is characterized. So we're going to talk about 4 core problems, core issues in office work that contribute to negative health implications, potentially. Sedentary lifestyle, poor diet habits, work stress, and this is all tied together by the culture of your individual office space, wherever that happens to be. So we'll come back to this every single time. So a few giggles when I said what you're going to be doing all day. This is what everyone thinks of, is sitting still, sedentary lifestyle. On average, most of you, if you work in an office environment, are going to be sitting for 8 hours a day while at work. Most of that continuous time, depending on your office environment. Wouldn't be unusual to expect someone to sit for a stretch of 4 hours in one shot without getting up, unless it's only to use the bathroom. On top of that, you probably have another 4 to 6 hours a day outside of work where you're also just sitting still. Commutes in the car, on the bus, sitting on the couch at home watching TV, sitting and eating dinner, so on. So there's another 4 to 6 hours probably there of time spent in the seated position. Jens is trying to sit with better posture as I talk about it. And another 60 hours where you're probably just lying still in bed, not moving, sleeping, somewhere in that range. Hopefully 8, but probably closer to 6. So we can see that this adds up very, very quickly. We're probably talking somewhere close to 20 to 22 hours out of your 24-hour day are spent in an unmoving, sedentary position. That's a lot, right? And the effects of that are going to be long-standing and important to your health. The direct effects of sitting all day, the things that we think of right away and need to address, are the impact on your metabolism, your mobility, and your brain function. So when I say metabolism, I'm talking about how your body processes food and calories and creates new tissue, things that help you grow and survive for long periods of time. Your metabolism will naturally slow as you age, but the more sedentary you are, the faster your metabolism will slow as well. So you have 2 things moving in the same direction, getting older and sitting still, that are working against you long term. You got to get up and move to try and keep those things up. Mobility is the ability to get into positions. We're going to talk about this more in a second. And the longer we stay seated in the same position, the worse it's going to get for us. And that's going to be the core focus of what I talk about in sedentary lifestyle today, because it's easy to demo, and I can give you some really quick practical strategies for addressing those things. Decreased brain function should matter to you, but also probably matters to your employer. If you're sitting still for long periods of time, your brain waves actually change to look more like sleep, or like when you're watching TV. You're kind of on autopilot. The longer you sit, the more entrenched those brain waves become. The indirect effects long term of this amount of sitting are things like correlates with obesity, diabetes, and depression. Well-established finding now. The longer you spend sitting in a day, the more likely it is that you will suffer from one or all of these ailments in your lifetime. This is a modern problem. 40 years ago, people didn't spend 8 hours a day sitting in an office in front of a computer terminal. It didn't happen. So because it's a modern problem, we're still in the process of finding modern solutions to these things. All right, so let's zero in on mobility and this concept of stability and why that matters. So when we're talking about sitting, we're talking about physical ailments that come from sitting for long periods of time. It impacts three main areas of your body, or three main processes that you're supposed to have. The first is flexibility. And flexibility is a range of motion of a muscle across a joint. So if Jens were to stand up and bend over with a nice flat spine and reach for his toes, this is roughly a measure of the flexibility of his hamstrings. We're seeing that across the joint in the back of his hip. So he has long, relatively long hamstrings. Pretty good. He can reach his toes with a pretty flat back, and that's not a compromised position for him. So that's flexibility. It's that range of motion of a muscle across a joint. Super simple. When you were in high school gym class or junior high gym class, when they got you to grab your toes and pull your knee down, they were talking about flexibility. But flexibility is just a very small slice of the problem. We want flexibility, but flexibility is probably the easiest thing to address. Mobility is the ability to achieve the required range of human motion with all of your joints and limbs in compound or complex movements. So when we're talking about flexibility, we're often usually talking about one muscle in one joint, focusing on that one thing at a time. But when we're talking about mobility, we're talking about your ability as a system to move into a position. So now that he's standing up tall, if he were to brace his core and reach both arms overhead, the ability to get into that position without being compromised, you want to turn to the side, without being compromised, let's break at the spine, that position, or even worse, this kind of position, has to do with your system-wide mobility, right? A bunch of different muscle groups and joints have to work together to achieve that position effectively. So mobility is this requirement to be able to achieve those positions with the whole body. The last piece of the puzzle is stability. And that's your ability to resist forces from gravity or external objects or motion. So if you're carrying something with one arm, your ability to resist gravity and not drop way down to one side, like your briefcase, for example, is a measure of your core stability in that plane of motion. So we need all three of those things to be super effective. And the problem with sitting or lying down in the same position for long periods of time is it immediately impairs your ability to achieve all three of these core ideas. So Jens wants to have a seat. He's gonna demo what's gonna happen. Side on's good. All right. So in this position, his hip angle is closed. So there's this big L shape at his hip. And if this is your office chair, that's what you're going to look like most of the time. He puts his hands up, as if he's typing, and rests his armrests on his chair. His shoulders are elevated up by his ears. So now we're in this position, and we spent 8 hours there. If you were to stand up and kind of keep that position, this is what happens to your body long term, right? It's hard to stand up tall with the knees extended because this angle is always closed and the muscles there are short. And your shoulders are always by your ears, so it always feels like you're drooped forward in this position. Sit on the bus on the way home and text on your phone for another 2 hours, and you're going to just reinforce that position even more. Hunched over shoulders. When my shoulder's up, you can't reach your arms overhead. Your shoulder doesn't work that way. It has to be set down and back in order to reach overhead in an effective position. So by staying in that position for a long period of time, he's compromised his mobility, his flexibility, and by not resisting any gravitational forces, his stability will get worse and worse over time as well. So I'm going to introduce an idea called the two-joint rule. And the two-joint rule is an older concept, but still really easy to talk about, that basically says that as a human system, your body has alternating, stable, and flexible joints. We start from the feet down, feet up, or the head down. So your shoulders should be pretty flexible. You should be able to get pretty big range of motion at the shoulder. Your elbows should be pretty stable, right? There's really only two planes of motion that you're elbow moves in. It really shouldn't move side to side very much at all, right? It's a very stable joint. Your wrist is very flexible. Your fingers are pretty stable. Every second joint, you see where I'm going with here. So if we start with the spine, and particularly with an emphasis on the hips to the shoulders, because that's what is really impaired in office work, your hips are supposed to be super flexible. You should have very flexible hips. So if you keep a perfect core and bend over and touch your toes, great. That's all hip hinging. That's all at one joint, right? One joint's moving here. Stand up tall. Your hips are supposed to be super flexible. Your low back is supposed to be very stable, very rigid. You're supposed to be able to create a lot of force and resist gravity with your low back. So if I were to get him to hold an object out in front of him, an imaginary object, and bend forward, that's going to be super stable. He's going to try and keep that low back in the exact same position the whole time. So you want to jump in that position. Now if he were to lose stability in that low back, he's going to end up shaped like a banana. We see that big curve across the top of his back. Sticks out nice and far, right? It's a big curve. Go ahead and stand up. The two-joint rule says that every second joint is supposed to be flexible or stable and alternating. And the problem is if one joint that is supposed to be flexible is impaired, the joint above or the joint below is going to pick up the slack. And it's not supposed to. That's bad for you. So if the hip's impaired, you're either going to have problems with your knees or your low back or both. Right? Super common. We talk to office workers, what bothers them all the time? It's always low back and knees. And that's because hip function is impaired from that same seated position we just talked about. Thank you. So, this can create something we call the injury cycle. And once we enter the injury cycle, it's really hard to get out. So we start with an injury, and that injury can be acute or chronic. Chronic injuries are ones that build up slowly over time, so you don't really notice an exact moment when your shoulder started to bug you. Just one day, you woke up and your shoulder just aches, and you can't figure out why. That's a chronic injury. It's an impairment that's built up from poor motor patterns or bad positions over long periods of time. Acute injuries are those ones where you know as soon as something happened, there's a moment you go, oh, I just hurt myself. I don't know what I did, but something's wrong. Those are usually, in 90% of cases, the result of mobility or stability problems at that joint, and you've asked that joint to do more than what it's currently capable of based on its health. Specific example. So Jens has been working at his computer for 8 hours a day for the last 2 months. He's had big deadlines. He's sinking into his work. He writes computer programming code, maybe. So he's in this position. Maybe he does accounting, finance. So he's here all the time. Data entry, always most one arm leaning into his work. Then, if he stands up and he goes to the gym and he decides he wants to press something overhead, from this position, he tries to press overhead, and he's been getting his position for a long period of time, but he's a pretty strong guy, so his triceps push through and shoulder goes. That's an acute injury, but that was caused by his chronic problems, by being in that seated position without having mobile, stable joints for long periods of time. So you go to the doctor and you say, I hurt my shoulder pressing overhead, and they say, don't go to the gym, that hurts you. But that's not the problem. The problem was this in the first place, right? He doesn't need to avoid pressing, he needs to fix his shoulders where they are. So we have an injury. This leads to impaired movement. So now he has an injury, his shoulder's hurt, and it's stuck there for the next 2 months after he has surgery and gets a tendon put back on there. So his tendon's put back, and he stays like this for 2 months, and then after that, he only does this with his swing arm. All the motion when he's at his computer chair from that point onwards is at the elbow. Arm does nothing. So now he also loses external rotation of the shoulder and internal rotation of the shoulder. This is a compounding problem. The longer we let him get away with not using the shoulder joint, the worse it's going to be long term. We end up with decreased mobility permanently if he doesn't address it right away. Or, I say permanently, but really we're talking the time frame to fix the problem goes from a couple weeks to a few months to several years of dedicated work the longer we let it sit that way. And because you're not using the joint and you have decreased mobility, other joints have to make up for it. And now we have chronic pain because stable joints have been asked to be flexible to make up for the deficiencies at his flexible joint. This is a cycle, right? We can see where this goes. And it repeats itself, unfortunately, many, many times. Okay, so the office diet. So we talked about mobility, stability. If we have any questions on that stuff, I'll come back right at the end. We'll jump back into that. I could talk forever, so if I let people ask questions now, we're never going to finish. So we talked about mobility, stability, and sedentary lifestyle. That's probably the core problem. And from our gym owner standpoint, that's the one that we work the hardest to address, is to try and get people into better positions, better movement, before we ask them to do a lot. Ask them to be better during the day. But office diet is an equally problematic and compounding problem. So I took a picture, and this is no sweat to the conference organizers. I see this everywhere I go because I talk about the same things. I present at conferences all over the place. And I always look at the table that's out there, and they're always the same, right? What was on the table? Muffins. It's always muffins, right? So that's common, and if you have food catered into the office for any kind of occasion, it's almost always the same for that reason. And if it's not muffins, when we're trying to be healthy, what is it? Fruit. Well, I have bad news for you. Your body doesn't really know the difference between fruit and muffins. Like it does on some level, but they're both just sugary carbohydrates in the end, right? So the office diet is generally characterized by eating whatever is available, whatever is at hand, and often purchasing food at work or nearby within that 2-block radius, because that's where you can pop down to on your break. So if you're not so fortunate to have Pete's Boutique in that 2-block radius, you're probably eating a lower quality food, something that's less resembles what you should be eating for a regular meal if you pack it yourself. We have this high carb, high fat tendency, so we always see things like muffins and scones and croissants and so on, right? So we generally see that mix of high carbohydrate, high fat, and a lot of added sugar. So depending on how those muffins are made, usually, in most cases, they're not like the home recipe that is as healthy as possible. They're the mass-produced, make them sweet, they're going to taste really awesome for 5 minutes muffins. They're going to be really high in sugar. So there's a lot more carbohydrates in that muffin than you want to think there are. Because it's only this big, right? It's really small. Feels small on your plate. And there's a lot of hidden calories everywhere else in the office that you don't think of. There's the cream that you put in your coffee. There's the handful of chocolate-covered almonds from your coworker's desk. There's that couple chips or crackers we don't think of. They don't factor in because we didn't plan those into our day. They just kind of happen there. Another characteristic of office work is forgetting to eat for long stretches of time, going 3, 4, 5, 6 hours without eating, and then binging to try and make up with how incredibly hungry you are at that exact moment. Think if I were to put Jens on the spot and ask him how many times he's done that.
Too many.
Too many, right? He works in finance and as CFO for Falk Safety, so I'm describing his day most of the time when I'm talking about this. And of course, another common office characteristic is, generally speaking, relatively high levels of alcohol consumption. A lot of social events, sometimes a common office gift, depending on the industry you're in, like if you're in mortgages or lending or anything like that, it's common for brokers to give people bottles of alcohol for presents. Again, we're talking about carbohydrates, really, talking about sugars. So this is what an office diet generally looks like if we don't control it. The problems with this kind of diet start with the basics. It starts with inflammation. And and not to get too deep into nutrition or diet talk, and when I say diet, I'm not talking about like going on a diet. I'm actually talking about the real sense of the word. Diet is what your food choices consist of, kind of diet. Depending on your choices, certain foods promote higher levels of inflammation in the body at the joints and at the cellular level. More inflammation means more problems down the road. Some foods lower the level of inflammation in your body. Depending on your diet, if there's not a lot of protein content in that diet, you're going to have difficulty supporting muscle growth, and decreasing levels of muscle mass in your body impair hormone production. We have increased fatigue. As we ride that insulin sugar spike wave, we get these big bursts of energy and these deep, deep lulls of fatigue following that mid-afternoon right after we have lunch. And we get higher levels of sickness. The more inflammation that there is in your body, the more your white blood cells have to do on a day-to-day basis, the less likely it is they're going to be able to fight off regular occurring colds, flus, and illnesses. You're fatigued, you're not sleeping as much, you're busy, you're stressed. We get a nice little bubble. Long term, those things translate to these things. We end up with higher levels of obesity, increased risk for diabetes, higher levels of cancer, and increased Alzheimer's risk based on those dietary choices. These are pretty well-established findings. There's a very strong relationship between diet and all four of these, including many other particular diseases like heart disease, for example. And we can be more preventative in the way we eat, or in some cases, not control what we're eating and contribute to a greater risk for all of these diseases. Okay. So, we have diet so far, and we have sedentary lifestyle. Those are the first two bubbles that I had in my circle. The third is work stress. Work stress is something that we all inherently know what it is, but it's hard for us to describe. When I ask people that aren't in the research community, tell me what work stress is, they can all give me examples of things that are stressful, but they can't really describe what work stress itself actually results in. So I'm going to give you three labels to think about here. We have stressors, we have stress, and we have strain. Stressors are the things that bother you. Those are the things that we think of as stress. They're the things that bother you. So these can be acute problems, just like injuries, they can be acute problems. My coworker yelled at me. This is a very obvious moment where I'm experiencing stress because of this. There's a threat that we're going to get laid off. That's a very acute problem. We know that there's a likelihood that that's going to be stressful. Or they can be chronic, very low-level, kind of subversive stressors, things you don't really pick up on every day. You don't notice them. They just build. And that's things like workload, work overload, not being able to disconnect from work. So having to take a phone home or check your email when you're home during your off time. It can be things like interpersonal conflict, but not that high, really obvious stuff. It can be like coworkers not helping each other or avoiding each other. We sometimes call that ostracism, like leaving other people out of the group just for whatever petty reason. It can be role overload or role ambiguity. When you're not really sure what is expected of you in your job, you just keep being given tasks, but no one has really sat down and told you what you do need to do on a daily basis and what isn't in your job description. There are a lot of stressors or stressful things out there that bother you that you don't look at that and go, this is making me stressed out right now. And it's not until they build to a climax where you suddenly realize there's a problem, and that's usually because you're showing symptoms. So we have the stressors. And depending on who you are, some of those things are more or less stressful to different individuals. Some people find time pressure helpful. It makes them work faster, and they don't actually get sick or ill or anything because of it later on. Other people find time pressure inherently very stressful, and they will start to break down as soon as they experience it. So that's where stress comes in. We experience a stressor, And depending on who we are and our different personality traits and resources and strengths, we might experience stress. The outcomes of stress are what we call strain in the research community. Those are the impacts, the long-term effects. And I'll come back to that, because the next slide I'm going to focus in on strain pretty much exclusively. Like I said, those can be chronic or acute. The acute ones, generally speaking, are highly intense, but very quick to be dealt with. The long-term impact on your health is very low for acute stressors. We enable some set of coping mechanisms, and as long as those are coping mechanisms that are positive, dealing with the problem, talking to the individual, removing ourselves from the situation, i.e. quitting our job or having the other person removed, the effects are dealt with immediately and they don't persist, generally speaking. The problem with chronic stressors is they are long-standing and the effects of them last for a very long period of time afterwards, even if you have finally found a way to deal with the situation. Most of the time, they're happening in the background and you don't notice they're there until it's too late, not to put too fine a point on it, because it's never really too late. You can always deal with this stuff. In the work stress kind of community, when we talk about work stress, one of the most important things is to understand that people have different levels of resources to deal with the same problem. So I already mentioned that some people might experience more or less stress from certain stressors, from events that happen in the workplace. But depending on your individual resources, what kind of support systems you have in place, your background, your knowledge, your skill set, you may be able to deal with those stressors much more effectively than a coworker. So to say that this idea is not really stressful to you long term doesn't necessarily apply to anyone else. Right? That's why we got to deal with the problem, not leave it to the individual to cope with it or carry on and get over it, right? Because every person is going to deal with those things differently. So I said I was going to zero in on strain and burnout. I'm going to separate the two. In the work environment, burnout is the one thing we like to talk about the most because it's the easiest to notice first. Burnout is characterized by a bunch of things. But realistically, we're talking about decreased work performance, so not being able to do the same tasks with the same level of ability, not because you don't want to, because your actual ability to produce work has been impaired in some way. You're no longer able to perform the same tasks. Cynicism, should be a big alarm, a big red flag. Being cynical about your work, not thinking it has an impact or is important anymore, not thinking that your actions can contribute to the outcome in any way. And those two things alone should tell you something's wrong. But if we also introduce high levels of exhaustion and fatigue, wanting to sleep all the time, falling asleep at your desk in the middle of the afternoon for not other reasons like not eating a giant hamburger at lunchtime and then falling asleep at your desk, and wanting to go lay down as soon as you get home, like the minute you walk in the door, laying down on the couch. If we have those three things going on, exhaustion, cynicism, and decreased work performance, that's a pretty good sign that you're suffering from work stress-related burnout. The only way to fix that is to separate yourself from that work stress in some way, either with time or distance, one or the other. That's how good companies lose great employees, because they're unable to create that separation through time or distance from those stressful events. Burnout is the one we're going to notice in the workplace, in ourselves or in our coworkers. But strain is another way of talking about outcomes. And when we talk about general strain, we're talking about things like impaired sleep, so like waking up at weird times in the middle of the night, rumination, thinking about work in the middle of the night, waking up, more injury risk, more sickness, being moody or having conflicts with family members or friends that you wouldn't normally have. Those are kind of the shorter term noticeable impacts of work stress. And then longer term, it's going to lead to a lot of the same bad things we talked about already. Increased risk of depression, increased risk of cancer, increased risk of obesity. Because all these actions, all these things have an impact on the body. You can't be sick forever and expect there to not be some kind of long-standing impact. So in the beginning, I put up this model of the 3 core problems related to modern office work, the 3 challenges we face: poor diet habits, sedentary lifestyle, and work-related stress. The biggest problem with the office environment is that culture, the culture of your individual office, is going to capture or encapsulate those 3 things and either make them much worse or minimize them as much as possible, depending on the type of culture you have. So I think we can all think of an office. Who's watched the TV show Mad Men? Who knows what Mad Men is? No? A few people? Okay. So we can all think of an office where the culture promotes very poor lifestyle choices. Really poor food choices, always eating out at restaurants, or not eating at all. At that time, in that age, there was a lot of smoking. We don't really see that as much in the office anymore. Really high levels of stress, deadlines, yelling at each other, very poor work stress-related environment, and long periods of sitting, 10, 12-hour work days, and so on. If that's the office norm, if that's what your coworkers do, and that's what you were brought into, that's what you're going to do as well. So you're already starting off in a bad place. Even if you want to be really good at all 3 of those things, if that's your regular office environment, it's going to be really tough to keep that up long term. You're only going to say, no, I'm not coming to lunch with you so many times to your coworker before you either feel like you're not part of the group, and that's stressful, or you'll break and say, fine, sure, we'll go to A&W for lunch again today. It's a cultural, in many cases, it's a cultural problem. We have so many people that have learned this behavior and they're just passing on to the next person that comes in the office and the next person and the next person. We can't shake it. You need to get a bunch of people to change their behavior all at once in order to have a real impact, to actually change something in that office environment. There's like 2 kind of psychology rules when it comes to how humans interact, right? The first rule is the idea of 3 places. So you're always going to have 3 extremely influential places on your life. And you will be the average of those 3 places. So that's your home life, your work life, and something else if you have a hobby. So you interact with, and usually, different groups of people in all 3 of those places, and your behavior might change in all 3 of those environments to match the group. We have 2 really positive ones and 1 negative one, we might be okay. If we have 3 really negative ones, we're probably going to have a problem. The other thing about that 3-place rule is that the longer you spend in one of those environments, the more impact it has. The work environment is the single place where you spend the most time, 8 hours a day. Generally speaking, if you work full-time. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. You're home in the evenings, but you go to bed at a certain point, and if you have a hobby outside of that, you're not even home for as long. So that work environment is the biggest place, it has the biggest impact on your long-term behavior. Second psychological rule about how you're going to behave is the idea of you being the average of your 6 closest friends. Has anyone heard that before? You're the average of your 6 closest friends? So as people come and go from your life, you start to change your behavior to match more with the interests of the 6 people you interact with the most, because they influence your behavior. If you spend a lot of time at work, and you always hang out with the same people at work, your behavior is eventually going to start to mirror their behavior more closely. So if you have 5 friends that engage in very high levels of all 3 of these negative behaviors, and you're the odd person out, if I leave you there long enough, your behavior will start to match their behavior. You'll become the average of those 5 people. Or 3 other people that you know in the rest of your life and 3 people that you hang out with at work. You'll start to split the difference so that you fit in. It's basic human behavior. So the culture of your office can drive high levels of health or impair your health, depending on how it's set up. And there are a bunch of things you can introduce right away to change your office culture if people wanted to change. Let's think of a few examples. I'm actually going to ask people to volunteer ideas. What could you do in your office culture to change diet habits? Potlucks with healthy food. Instead of going out to a restaurant, we could potluck with healthy food instead. There's a simple idea.
Just bring a healthy lunch.
Bring lunch. We only go out as an office, we only ever go out for lunch on Fridays. Monday through Thursday, bring your own lunch. If you ask me to leave my desk or leave the office to go get lunch, not happening, sorry. But Fridays, I'd be happy to go out for lunch with you. Good start, right? What else can we do for diet in the office?
Make sure that you don't skip lunch. Make sure that you don't skip lunch.
Right. Create an environment where it's perfectly acceptable to call out a coworker for skipping lunch and sitting at their desk the whole time. So in my office, if I see my coworkers working through lunch with no food in front of them, I will 100% say something to them every single time. It's lunchtime. Get up from your desk, go get some food, don't do any work for the next 45 minutes. You have to do something. And it has to be okay in your office to say those kinds of things. What about lifestyle? What can we do for lifestyle?
Yoga.
Yoga. Okay, we do yoga at lunch. Awesome. What if that's not super accessible? Go for a walk. It's pretty easy to go for a walk, especially in this beautiful city in the summer. Go out, boardwalk, downtown, wherever. Just get out of the office, go somewhere. Fresh air. What else can we do?
Exercises at our desk.
Exercise at your desk? Yeah, this is a hard one, right? Culture has a really important impact. Would anyone think it was weird if you walked into my office and I was just hanging out like this? If you did this for long periods of time and enough people told you to stop acting like an idiot in your office, would you stop doing it? Maybe. People are influenced by the opinions of others. It's unfortunate, but it's how it is. So I could spend 2 or 3 minutes down here in the bottom of a squat just getting comfortable, but if enough people told me that was weird, I might stop, because that's the culture. They're going to push you to change how you behave, because it makes them uncomfortable, and they don't want to be uncomfortable, so they're going to say something, and then that's how human behavior changes. What about work stress? What kind of culture can we change when it comes to work stress? Well, I'm going to give you a few ideas if we don't have any to offer up. One is setting boundaries about when and where people are expected to answer emails and phone calls. So if you answer emails, you yourself answer emails at 10:30 at night all the time, it's going to come to be an expectation that you will routinely answer emails at 10:30 at night all the time. And then you'll be checking your email at 10:30 at night all the time. If you're sticking around for my next talk in a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit more about why that's a problem. But you can change, in some ways, the culture of your company by setting clear boundaries when it comes to certain kinds of behaviors. I would suggest, if at all possible, you should set blackout hours. And it can be an office policy, or it doesn't have to be formal. You don't have to have something in writing that says no one's going to answer email between 9 and 7, for example. But people will expect what you do. So if you do something all the time, you answer emails late at night, they're going to expect you to do that over long periods of time. Then when you do it, out of the blue, it's an exception rather than the rule. Only reserved for really important situations. And they do come up, right? But it can't be something you do all the time. That's one thing you can do to change the work stress culture of your company. Any other ideas out there?
I think it's important that employers recognize time, and that for healthy choices. As an example, we started, and there's 4 of us now, that go to a personal trainer at 4 o'clock on Monday. It was Monday, Thursday, now it's Monday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so, to be respectful of that time, the group of us, we have very few sick days. we're there, we're present, but
Yeah.
they respect that time. Yes, there's times that we can't go, but a work meeting is not scheduled at 4.
That's perfect, right? That's a really, not only did you introduce a really good idea, but also a solution. So having set hours of the day when it's okay to schedule work meetings. Is it appropriate to schedule a work meeting at 11:30 in the morning? It shouldn't be, because there's a really good chance that's going to go straight through your lunch hour, and you're not going to eat, and you're going to go back to your desk. If possible, we should respect those time frames with other people and try and do set hours to schedule those kinds of group activities. As far as supporting employee health initiatives, that's a big sales pitch point, right? When I, as a researcher, give talks at business conferences, one of the things I try and hit home the most is that the time you invest in your employees' health will come back to you tenfold. It always comes back to you. Less sick days, less long-term and short-term disability stints when you have to hire a whole other person to do the same job, paying 2 people at once. And they're more productive. We talked about the brainwave piece right at the very beginning. If you're up and moving throughout the day, you perform at a higher level than someone who is sitting for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year. We can create cultural initiatives. We can change, and that doesn't start necessarily when you're in upper or high level management at a company. You can start to change the culture of your office from the day you get there if you recognize what's important and ask people to come along for the ride with you, right? Make sense? So, that's my talk for right now. Hopefully some of you are going to stick around for the next one. We're going to talk about practical strategies for improving your health, be very practical about what we can do. And if you have any questions on the break, come on up and ask, and I'm happy to chat. Thanks.
Thank you.